Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am reviewing an Agatha Christie novel, Sparkling Cyanide, celebrating its 80th anniversary in 2025. This is a bit of an unusual Christie, in my opinion. I think it's her most glamorous novel. It's also one of her novels where she focuses primarily on the character work as opposed to the mystery itself. It's in the same company as Five Little Pigs, The Hollow, Sad Cypress, etc. It's about 80% character work, which means that 20% mystery mechanics do get a little fuzzy, but more on that later. This is also the final appearance of Colonel Race. Colonel Race is a recurring character, I could mostly do without, especially in this novel where I'm not even sure, what he's doing here. But anyway, he's extraneous, in my opinion. But what makes this novel unusual to me is that in some ways, Sparkling Cyanide is unimportant to the greater Christie canon. I don't see it as an influential work to Christie's future writing, and it's not discussed really ever in reference to other novels. Personally, I never really think of Sparkling Cyanide when I read other novels. I don't see all these little connections or whatever. I don't see it discussed alongside many other novels. Even when thinking of mysteries where the victim is poisoned in a glass of alcohol, I think of Three Act Tragedy. I think of The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. I even think of Ellery Queen's Calamity Town before I think of Sparkling Cyanide. It's like a true standalone outside the appearance of Colonel Race, who, again, just really inessential in this book. But I love Sparkling Cyanide. I forgot how good this book was. Of course, I knew it was good, but my appreciation of it on this reread went way up. But I will get into that also. And as a reminder, I will give a spoiler free summary and commentary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which time I will let you know it's coming so you can back out if you need. Spoilers will be fair game from that point forward. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Sparkling Cyanide begins with Christie informing us that Rosemary Barton died 1 year ago and 6 people were thinking of her. The first of these people is Iris Marle, Rosemary's younger sister by 6 years. She never really thought of Rosemary in this sort of introspective sort of way until Rosemary's husband, George, asked her a few questions about Rosemary. Iris and Rosemary had an odd relationship. Because of their age difference, they weren't particularly close, but they weren't estranged either. Rosemary died from allegedly committing suicide via cyanide from post-flu depression, an explanation that seemed plausible to both Iris and George. Iris recalls the swelling and the blueness of Rosemary's face, and just a few days before she died, Rosemary wrote not a will, but a piece of paper listing certain items to be left to certain people should she pass away. Iris found this strange since Rosemary was still very young, and Rosemary was an heiress to her uncle Paul, who wasn't really her uncle, but a man who fell in love with Rosemary and Iris's mother. When he died, Rosemary inherited everything, which left Iris resentful. But when Rosemary died, the estate passes on to Iris, per Uncle Paul's will. However, Iris is not yet 21, nor is she married, so she doesn't have the control of the estate just yet. Iris continued living with George after Rosemary died because George asked her to stay. Iris's aunt Lucilla Drake also moved in as well. Lucilla Drake is one of those poor relations of rich families we often see in Christie. In her case, it's her son Victor, who is a ne'er-do-well who spends all of her money. Approximately 6 months after Rosemary died, Iris found a love letter Rosemary wrote to someone she called Leopard and wanted to leave her husband for. Iris wonders who this man could be, and she thinks it could be Stephen Faraday, but Stephen is this boring and up and coming politician who is also married. She then thinks maybe it was Anthony Brown because he's young and handsome. In fact, Iris has recently started seeing Anthony Brown, and George keeps asking a lot of questions about him. Iris notices George has been acting very strangely lately, including warning Iris about Anthony and saying that no one really knows anything about him, and he didn't realize how close Anthony and Rosemary were until after Rosemary died. George also rents a house in the country next to the Farradays, which makes Iris very uncomfortable and baffled by this. Eventually, George confides in Iris that he's been receiving anonymous letters stating Rosemary did not commit suicide. She was murdered. And George thinks there is some merit to this because that whole post flu depression thing just didn't ring true. Iris, however, thinks it is possible she committed suicide because she wrote that note about leaving all her possessions after she died. Rosemary died at her birthday dinner at the Luxembourg restaurant via cyanide. A cyanide packet was found in her purse. George reasons that if Rosemary was murdered, one of the other six people at the table must have killed her. The other six were George, Iris, Stephen Farraday, Stephen's wife Sandra, Anthony Brown, and Ruth Lessing, who was George's secretary. George believes Rosemary was murdered and he vows to find out who killed her. The second person thinking of Rosemary is Ruth Lessing. She's George's secretary and very much like Miss Lemon in the fact that she exists only for secretarial work. She is efficient and she runs George's business and George's life. Ruth was thinking about how much she hated Rosemary. I mean, she hated her when she was alive, and she still hates her now that she's dead. Specifically, Ruth recalls an incident shortly before Rosemary died, where George asked her to take a check to Victor Drake. Victor was back in London and trying to get money out of Rosemary. George just wants him to go away, but doesn't want to meet with him himself, so he asks Ruth to do it for him. Ruth agrees, as is her nature. She meets Victor at a hotel, and she's supposed to see him off on a boat to Rio de Janeiro. George is essentially paying Victor to go away. But Victor, being the admittedly charming swindler, puts the moves on Ruth, and she does find him charming. He tells her all about his life and how he never worked an honest day's work despite having all these jobs like a waiter, a property manager, an actor. She dislikes Victor, but Ruth also finds something about him pleasant. Victor tells her that he did get money out of Rosemary already, and that if Rosemary died, Ruth could marry George just like it was meant to be. Ruth hates Victor, and she hates that he read her so perfectly, and she hates that Rosemary gave money to Victor. She hates that Rosemary forgot about Ruth attending her birthday party, but she is still charmed by Victor, and she's glad Rosemary is dead, and she lives up to the ruthlessness her name implies. The third person thinking of Rosemary is Anthony Brown. Anthony loved going out and dancing with Rosemary, but he found her not very interesting to talk to. He's far more interested and enamored with Iris. He especially fell out of it with Rosemary when Rosemary told him she knows his real name is Tony Morelli and that he's an Italian who spent time in prison. She knows this because he was in prison with her cousin Victor Drake, although Anthony didn't know him under that name. And Victor Drake told her all about Tony. Anthony is furious with Rosemary and threatens to carve her pretty face up, and not to speak about this to anyone in yet another unflattering and violent depiction of an Italian in a Christie novel. The fourth person thinking of Rosemary is Stephen Farraday, although he doesn't think of her for long. His thoughts immediately turn to how he met his wife, Sandra. Farraday had a rough upbringing. He did have a stammer, and he wasn't well off, but he was determined to conquer both, which he did. After college, he was drawn to politics, and although he was a liberal, he joined the Labour Party because that was the party banner easiest for him to get elected under, and then he switched to conservative because that party asked him to. I mean, Christie depicts this as a positive, which is interesting to me because it sort of exposes Stephen Farraday as a man without principles. That is a negative trait. But once in Parliament, Farraday became frustrated as a backbencher. The Conservatives just wanted young blood to be a vote. They didn't care about his ideas or anything like that. And Farraday eventually meets Sandra, Lady Alexandra Hale, and she is the awkward youngest daughter of the powerful Kidderminster family. Stephen falls for Sandra, who is dedicated to his advancing political career. He recognizes her family is influential in politics and can help him. Everything Stephen and Sandra do in their lives is carefully crafted to advancing his image. That is, until he meets Rosemary on vacation. Stephen is enamored with Rosemary. He loves Sandra, but he's passionate about Rosemary, and Rosemary loves him. He is Leopard. And he gets very mad at Rosemary's increasing desire to spend time with him because he knows Sandra will not tolerate infidelity and Rosemary's potentially a risk to his political career. He must end it with Rosemary, but he doesn't know how to do this without Rosemary like running to George or running to Sandra. Stephen then remembers Rosemary's face after she died because he had once thought of poisoning her champagne as well. The fifth person thinking of Rosemary is Sandra Farraday, and despite what her husband thinks, she knows about his affair with Rosemary. She knew from the second Stephen laid eyes on Rosemary that he was in love with her, and Sandra always knew Stephen had no passion for her, but she was okay with that because she assumed he was just not a passionate man. But when Rosemary came along, that all changed, but Sandra never let Stephen know she knew. Needless to say, she also hates Rosemary. Unlike everyone else, Sandra recalls an incident leading up to Rosemary's death, in which all of the women were in the bathroom, and Rosemary asked Sandra if she had an aspirin because she had a headache, and Sandra gave her one. Sandra found this odd because Rosemary was closer to both Iris and Ruth and would be more likely to ask one of them for an aspirin. The final person thinking about Rosemary is her widower, George Barton. He's thinking about those notes he received that Rosemary did not die a natural death. It always seemed strange to him that Rosemary committed suicide despite what he claimed. That wasn't like her. And he has this idea that he's going to assemble everyone who was at Rosemary's birthday party as sort of a trap, and he uses Iris's upcoming birthday as an excuse to hold this party. And now we are firmly in the present. Everyone is still reminiscing about Rosemary every now and then, but we are in the current day. And the Farradays realize that George is trying to trap them. They don't trust him, but they agree they have to go to Iris's party because George has sort of turned the tables on them, so they can't really get out of it. And they also have a frank discussion about their marriage when Sandra tells Stephen she did know about his affair with Rosemary. And Stephen professes Sandra as his true love and that he never really liked Rosemary outside of the physical nature of their relationship and that he actually grew to dislike her. Sandra makes this very cryptic comment about how she wished she knew that earlier and how she wished she knew Stephen did not intend to run away with Rosemary. She asks him why he never told Rosemary he wouldn't go away with her, and Stephen implies that Rosemary died before he could. Meanwhile, Anthony Brown has stalked out Iris and asks her if she trusts him, and she says yes. He then asks her to marry him in secret and not tell anyone, to which she declines. Also, she's a minor here, which makes this very weird. We don't get an actual specific age for Iris, but she is referred to as a minor, though the will of Uncle Paul referred to her, she had to be married at 21, so I think minor might just be under 21 and not under 18, but anyway, it's really weird to me. But anyway, Iris refuses to marry Anthony because she doesn't want to leave George in a lurch, and because of Anthony's connection to Rosemary. Iris asks Anthony if he thinks Rosemary could have been murdered, but he firmly rejects that idea. George calls his old friend, Colonel Race, to help with his plans, and I have to be honest here, I have no idea why Colonel Race is in this book. And as is typical for Colonel Race, outside of the man in the brown suit, he doesn't really add anything or do anything to the story. This is also his last appearance, but anyway, George bounces a few ideas off of Colonel Race, and who warns him that he should go to the police because it's dangerous to investigate a murder alone. So naturally, George ignores this suggestion. Race also says that while it doesn't make sense for Rosemary to have committed suicide, there's no real evidence someone killed her either. There was cyanide in her champagne, and there are several people who could have placed it there, including Rosemary herself. Stephen Farraday was sitting closest to Rosemary's champagne glass, so maybe he did it. Colonel Race suggests Iris, as she was Rosemary's heiress, and, money always being the biggest motive in mystery novels. The possibility of a woman murderer is also discussed because Colonel Race backed out of Rosemary's party at the last minute, so that meant there was an extra woman left behind alone at the table when everyone else went to dance. The waitstaff, we are told, are above suspicion. It's the morning of the new party for Iris, and Aunt Lucia is all upset again. Dear Victor got himself into another situation and needs money, otherwise he's going to kill himself. Poor dear. Aunt Lucia is upset. Poor Victor got swindled again because he's so good natured and he needs the money. So George sends Ruth to take care of this once again. At the Luxembourg restaurant, everyone shows up, much to George's delight. He's had the table decorated with rosemary because rosemary means remembrance, which is a phrase that's repeated in this book ad infinitum to an almost unintentional comedic effect. George dictates where everyone sits. Sandra Farraday sits on his direct right, then Anthony Brown on her right, then from George's left, Iris, then Stephen Farraday, then Ruth Lessing, with an empty chair reserved for Colonel Race between Ruth and Anthony Brown. I'll get to this in the criticism section, but I think Christie makes an error here in the seating arrangement. But, there's definitely also a larger issue. I'll get into that. Anthony very quickly announces he might have to leave early. But the party goes on. Everyone dances, the lights go out for some of the dances, and when the light comes on, everybody's fine. Everyone was expecting something to have happened because the last time the lights came on in the Luxembourg, they found Rosemary dead. I like the way Christie delivers this information to us. The details of Rosemary's death are scattered throughout the first half of this novel and not presented in chronological order or an info dump, but revealed to us in bits and pieces whenever someone reminisces about her. George offers a toast to Iris, to which everybody drinks the champagne except Iris. Everybody dances again and returns to the table. George gives a speech about why he really assembled everyone there. He takes a sip of his champagne and promptly dies in the same exact way Rosemary died, from cyanide poisoning. His face turns blue and convulses. Christie writes it took a minute and a half for George Barton to die. Colonel Race visits Inspector Kemp, who is our generic police inspector character who made absolutely no impression on me whatsoever. The two discuss the case and reveal pretty much nothing. George died from cyanide poisoning and no one saw anything. The idea is brought up that George may have committed suicide since he was acting strangely as of late, but Race thinks that's ridiculous because Iris did show him those anonymous notes. We learn very passively here that Anthony Brown deals in armaments, and that's why he's worked in a few places, although those places have been sabotaged lately. Kemp visits some people who are sitting at the nearby tables at the Luxembourg. Most of these people just provide no information, but there's Pedro Morales, an American, and oh boy, does he speak in American slang. It's like Christie purchased a book of American slang and just copied from it for his dialogue. It's so over the top. It's so ridiculous. And his girlfriend speaks a little less in slang, but at least she did see something. She was watching the table for a while, and she says no one went near George's glass after his toast to Iris. But she did see a waiter come by and pick up Iris's purse, which fell to the floor. He placed it on her chair, and she says this wasn't the head waiter. This was some kind of a lower down on the hierarchy waiter. Apparently there's a hierarchy of waiters. Kemp also interviews our main suspects, starting with the Farradays. They don't know anything. This interview was pointless from a plot perspective, but very good from a character perspective. Lady Sandra's parents, Lord and Lady Kidderminster, get into an argument here. Lord Kidderminster thinks Stephen did it, while Lady Kidderminster thinks their daughter did it, which I always find very funny. She wants her husband to bribe someone to get Sandra off, and she's completely convinced herself her daughter is guilty for really no reason. And I will say, once George dies, this novel does take a bit of a downturn in quality. It's not like it gets bad, but there's a noticeable shift in quality. And Christie, has been focusing so much on the characters, in this moment, with Lady and Lord Kidderminster, there's almost a reluctance to move into the mystery part of it. It's very Niall Marsh in that regard. Niall Marsh is someone who does this a lot. They have just so much fun setting up the plot and setting up the characters. There's a point where they go, all right, gotta get on with this murder thing. I don't think the murder mechanics of Sparkling Cyanide are that interesting in terms of the investigation. There are interesting things about them, for sure, but these interviews are not one of them. Iris sort of blurts out in front of Aunt Lucia and Colonel Race that she does intend to marry Anthony Brown, but she rejected his idea to get married in secret. Race had previously learned that Anthony Brown threatened to carve up Rosemary because of that conversation was overheard by a maid, and this is another error here, because that conversation we're told happened in a car, and the maid said she heard it from the dining room. I guess the maid could have been lying. But this has Aunt Lucia very upset, but Colonel Race realizes when he finally meets Anthony Brown that Anthony is not a criminal that he was claimed to be, but he's a spy. That's why he was in prison and all these other places. He was tracking someone down. Inspector Kemp is approached by an actress named Chloe West, who says George Barton hired her essentially to play the part of Rosemary at the party because he wanted a shock moment by having her, quote, ghost, unquote, reappear. However, he canceled at the last minute, which Chloe suddenly thinks wasn't really George Barton. Iris confides in Anthony Brown that after George collapsed, she reached into her purse for a handkerchief and found an empty packet of cyanide, just like what happened with Rosemary. She panicked and tossed it onto the floor, and she thinks Ruth saw her. Anthony had long suspected Ruth of murdering Rosemary because she was in love with George, but this sort of clears Ruth because if Ruth had been guilty, she would have said something about Iris dropping this packet. Race thinks the murderer has to be Iris, still, and Kemp thinks it's Lady Farraday, but when they discuss this, they talk about how no one could have poisoned George's glass. There's a lot of evidence that no one went near it. And then it clicks for Anthony what must have happened. And worst of all, he thinks someone else is in danger. Race had previously mentioned that whoever wrote those anonymous notes is probably in potential danger, and this is where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. Aunt Lucia, Iris, and Ruth Lessing gather to make arrangements for George's funeral. Iris tells Anthony before he leaves for the police station that someone nearly hit her with their car, and he doesn't think anything of this, which should have been a pretty big indication that Iris is the person whose life is in danger. But Anthony goes to the police station, and then he has his epiphany, and he runs back to Iris, convinced she's now even in more danger, and is stopped by Lucilla Drake, who keeps rambling on about nonsense for several pages, until he and Inspector Kemp can escape, and they find Iris passed out in front of the fireplace with the gas running, and what appears to be a suicide attempt, but was really a failed murder plot. Anthony explains all to Iris when she comes through. Rosemary was murdered. George was also murdered, but that was an accident. This is a rare Christie in which the wrong person really was murdered. It often looks like that from a plot perspective, but then it turns out not to be the case. The victim was the intended victim all along. Here, it really is an accident, even though it never really looked like one. As Anthony Brown figured out while discussing George's glass, he realized no one could ever poison George's glass. But what if the glass George drank out of wasn't really his glass? What if that was Iris's glass? The waiter who picked up Iris's purse when it fell replaced it onto the wrong chair. When everyone returned to the table, Iris naturally sat at the seat where her purse was. But this shifted everyone one seat over. So when George drank the champagne, he was actually drinking from Iris's glass. Iris did not drink when she was being toasted, as is natural, so her glass was poisoned much earlier in the evening. I have a lot of issues with the plot mechanics here. I'll get there in the criticism section, but to me, this plot just does not work. And we see Christie have this issue sometimes in her novels that are so focused on the character work, she doesn't really fit in the murder mechanics. Well, you have the likes of Five Little Pigs and The Hollow, which have sort of bare bones plot mechanics. And while they aren't the most interesting murder mechanics, I think the bare bones sort of works much better in these type of stories than Christie tries to do like fancier, more convoluted mechanics, because she's not fully focusing on the murder. She's more concerned about not upsetting the character work. Like Sad Cypress has an even worse problem with sparkling cyanide in this regard. But anyway, the cyanide was in Iris's glass, and who would want to kill Iris? Well, Iris inherited all of that money from Rosemary. And should Iris die without a husband or an heir before she reaches the age of 21, that money goes to her closest living relative, Aunt Lucia. But Lucilla Drake was not at the Luxembourg, and she's definitely not the kind of person who would be a murderer. But her son Victor Drake is. If his mother inherited Iris's fortune, Victor would have no problem getting the money out of her. I mean, it's like basically his job. Posing as a waiter, Victor poisoned Iris's glass earlier in the evening, much earlier than it was believed the poisoning could have happened. Remember when Victor told Ruth Lessing he had many careers in his life? One of those careers was a waiter, and another was an actor, and here he's acting as a waiter. But wait, there's more. Victor was supposed to be in South America on the day George was murdered, and he was supposed to be on the ship when Rosemary was murdered, but he wasn't. We only have Ruth Lessing's word that she saw him off. In fact, Ruth is the only person at that table who ever met Victor Drake as Victor Drake. She's his accomplice. She put the packet of cyanide in Iris's purse to make it look like suicide, just like she had done with Rosemary. Ruth fell in love with Victor Drake when George sent her to pay him off a year ago, and they conspired to murder Rosemary and then murder Iris so the inheritance would pass to Lucilla Drake. Victor was at the restaurant for the second party. In fact, he was not only the waiter, but he was also our friend Pedro Morales. When Iris failed to die, they had to hurry because Iris was about to marry Anthony. It was Ruth who nearly ran over Iris with her car and then lied about it by saying she took the subway. And it was Ruth and Victor who sent those anonymous notes to George. Of course, as George's loyal secretary, George showed those notes to Ruth. He confided in her. This book is actually a very good one to use my how to solve a murder mystery with meta clues video for. As the secretary, Ruth knows everything. She's in position to know everything. Her plan here was to convince George to have this second party where she and Victor could then off Iris and make it look like a suicide again. And we don't get any details on how specifically Rosemary was poisoned, but I think we could assume that that was Ruth. I don't think Victor was ever said to be at the Luxembourg for that first party. So Ruth killed Rosemary, and then Victor technically killed George. I believe when I ranked every Christie killer, I said Ruth killed them both. That's not correct. I also definitely underplayed Victor's role in the murders in that video. But as usual in Christie, we have a match. Iris will, of course, marry Anthony Brown, and the Farradays will stay together, having realized they really do love each other for each other. All right, let's get into praise. Sparkling Cyanide contains some of Christie's best character work. This is a top-tier novel for characters. I had the Farradays on the top one-time Christie characters who were not murderers or victims. I thought Iris Marle and Anthony Brown were far better characters than I had remembered. Ruth Lessing and Victor Drake were fantastic killers. I definitely underscored them on my murderer ranking. Rosemary and George were fantastic as victims. And Rosemary's the kind of victim we sometimes see in Christie who is dead before the novel begins, and we know so much about her from just other people's reminiscences of her. George is a very good character as well. A bit of a surprise victim, if you ask me. I mean, the first time I read this book nearly 20 years ago, I was shocked he was a victim. He did not feel like one, and I mean that in a good way. And Lucilla Drake, too. Fantastic comic relief in the way she rambles on about nothing all the time. All the main characters are well above average quality in this book. Even the minor characters, like Sandra Faraday's parents, were wonderful. There's a criticism out there of mystery novels, and of Christie in particular, that the characters are always bland, and they're static, and they're stock characters. Sparkling Cyanide is a novel I would point to convince people to rid themselves of that erroneous belief. Christie does such a beautiful job intertwining the characters into the murder plot. They are not severable, and this is why I believe the adaptations of this novel just have not worked very well. You can't just take the framing of the murder plot and do all these weird things with the characters. It doesn't really work. And as I said, I have some issues with the murder mechanics. We'll get into that, but I think overall the concept of this murder plot is intriguing and a lot of fun. Was Rosemary murdered? How did it happen? Who did it? Even the way her murder and George's murder were pulled off is still a great read, if you don't think too hard about it. Christie also sets the tone very well. It's sort of this moody and maudlin, but also glamorous and thought-provoking. She knows exactly the right places to insert humor via Lucilla Drake. When I ranked all the Christie novels, I ranked Sparkling Cyanide number 8 of 21 Christie standalones. I would move that up one spot to number 7, so it's above N or M. As much as I love N or M, what was Sparkling Cyanide doing below it? Unfortunately, I can't move Sparkling Cyanide up anymore just because the murder mechanics kind of don't work, but I'll get into that very shortly. And for the criticism, it mainly involves the murder plot. I mean, to me, there are significant plot holes and errors in the murder plot that are noticeable and affect my opinion of the book. These plot holes are not ones that you have to think particularly hard about to see. They're pretty obvious if you're thinking about them even slightly. I can't ignore them for the purposes of assessing this book. I can't ignore these and say, oh, well, that's the fun of the mystery novel. The issue is with George's murder. Rosemary's murder is fine, outside of the fact that we never were given specific details on what exactly happened there, but enough information is provided that you can figure it out. The problem involves that waiter who picked up Iris's purse and replaced it to the wrong chair. That caused everyone to shift one seat over to the left. The problem here is that that just wouldn't happen. Because everyone was dancing, the other women also wouldn't have had their purses with them. Ruth and Sandra's purses would still have been in their chairs, so even if Iris sat in the wrong seat, Ruth and Sandra would sit in the right seat. I also find it hard to believe that not one of six people didn't recognize they were all in the wrong seats. I always remember where I'm sitting at parties and dinners like this. I mean, just this past weekend, I attended a party and sat at a big round table like the one at the Luxembourg. There were 8 people instead of 6 and a blank space. But let me tell you, that table is big enough that even a slight shift one way or the other feels totally different. I can't believe this happened in the novel, especially since the Luxembourg has a blank space, which means a whole place setting that wasn't even touched. And this is one, of George, especially on George, paying very close attention to the details and what everyone is doing and where everybody's sitting. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And I also have a problem with George's plans for that second party. I mean, he's supposed to be sitting everyone in the same seats they were during the first party, but they're not. And they're sitting in completely different order, which even if that was intentional, like, why would they do that? It doesn't make any sense. Like, you should have them sit in exactly the same seats. But other than those plot issues, I have basically no notes. I mean, I think Colonel Race's presence totally unnecessary. And once George dies, I think the book does noticeably dip in quality. Not that it gets bad or anything, but the first half was just so strong, the second half couldn't compete, and it was noticeable. And the last thing here to mention is some very minor and not great comments made about Italians and Hispanic people. It's not great that Victor Drake, a white man, is impersonating a Hispanic man with a terrible American vernacular. But these weren't anywhere near as bad to leave like a negative impression, but still always something I think worth pointing out. Onto our characters, starting off with Colonel Race, who I guess is our protagonist. I mean, not really. And I guess he was fine. Like, I like making fun of Colonel Race a lot, probably to an unwarranted degree. But the problem here is that he's our main recurring character, our supposed hero, and he doesn't even solve the case. Anthony Brown does. Colonel Race didn't really seem to do much of anything except to be a person others bounce ideas off of, which, to be fair, is also his role in like Death on the Nile and Cards on the Table. But in those books, Poirot is there. We don't have Poirot here to lead the story, and perhaps Christie didn't intend for Race to be the hero, but then why was he there? Many of the adaptations, if not all of them, cut Colonel Race out, which I think speaks volumes to his necessity to the story. And to be fair, it's not like he does nothing. He does do some interviewing, some investigating, but I never felt like there was ever a need for Colonel Race to be in the story. There isn't like spy work going on here. I mean, sure, Anthony is a spy, but there's no spy thriller elements here. I did not need Colonel Race here, and I don't know why he was. Onto our murderers, starting with Ruth Lessing, who was a good character, and to be honest, I do think she could have lived more up to her name, being more ruthless. When I ranked every Christie killer, I had Ruth Lessing at number 41 of 100 killers, and I think she should be moved up. She's actually around like a group of other killers I think I ranked too low, considering some of the ones I have above her. I think like in the low 30s or high 20s seems a little bit more appropriate. Although I maintain with a name like Ruth Lessing, she should have been more ruthless. I wanted her evil. But I really enjoyed her. I mean, she's your typical loyal secretary, the person in position to control things and in position to know everything. I really loved her story arc as this sort of Miss Lemon-like character who is also just extremely vindictive. I think you can make the argument that Victor Drake manipulated her into murdering Rosemary and then Iris, but I don't think that's truly the case. I think Victor Drake was the catalyst for it for sure, but she definitely wanted to murder Rosemary because she hated Rosemary. I mean, the moment when Rosemary tells Ruth she forgot she was invited to her birthday party really sealed the deal. Like, I love how petty that is. And, that was the final straw for Ruth. And I certainly think Richter encouraged Ruth, and maybe she wouldn't have done it otherwise, but she was not manipulated into doing it. And for Victor Drake, I had him at number 83 of 100 Christie Killers, which is ridiculously low. I definitely underestimated his role in those murders when I made that video. He should be way higher, like in the 50s or 40s even. He was such a fun character. I love these characters who like own their evil. He's so good at it. And he's never pretending to be like a stand-up kind of guy, even despite what his mother thinks. But he knows he's a bad seed and owns it. I mean, the way he scrapes money out of his mother is just so devious and hilarious.
hilarious, especially how she falls for it constantly. I did ding him for like the silliness of pretending to be Pedro Morales, but it's also kind of funny. And also a big clue, like Pedro Morales talks like an American slang dictionary, which is a clue. No one actually speaks that way unless they're pretending. Victor was such a good character, and one we saw a lot more of than I remembered. I love the clue about him listing his jobs, and two of them are actor and waiter. It combines the laundry list clue with the occupation clue. He was more of an equal partner to Ruth. I remembered him as more of a sidekick, and that is incorrect. And onto our victims, starting off with Rosemary Barton. Rosemary means remembrance, in case you missed that the first 50 times Christie mentions it. But Rosemary was a good character. I love these victims we learn so much about from through the lenses of other people. Christie is an expert at this. It's so delightful learning about Rosemary bit by bit. Rosemary is not unique among Christie victims. I would say someone like a Helen from Sleeping Murder is very much like Rosemary, and even like an Arlena from Evil Under the Sun is too, though we do actually meet Arlena. Rosemary is, the young woman who just wants to have fun. She's carefree, and she doesn't really care, or I think more accurately, she isn't aware of the effect her actions have on other people. She doesn't understand why Anthony doesn't want his past out there, or why Iris is so mad about Rosemary's wealth, or why Stephen is so attached to his wife, or why George gets upset at Rosemary going out with other men. She's very clearly crafted to be a victim in the way she's blissfully unaware of her actions. And even her dealings with Victor Drake are kept secret. And to be fair, since Victor so easily got money out of Rosemary, I don't know if it was absolutely necessary for him to kill her, since she seemed pretty easy to get money out of. But I found Rosemary to be one of Christie's greatest victim characters. George Barton is our other victim, and he was also a great character. I think he's probably not as memorable as many of the other characters in this book, but still he had a great presence, and the person who was driving the plot forward. It's very strange to have such a character described as stodgy, practical, and dull be such an entertaining character. And he did seem to be a bit aloof at times, like he trusts Ruth with too much information, and he didn't realize the extent Rosemary's relationships were with other men, but and I think this is a result of his practical mind not being able to comprehend much outside of his normal course of events. And we see him try to get clever by exposing Rosemary's murder and wound up getting murdered himself. He also doesn't heed the advice of Colonel Race not to do that in the first place. I found George a very interesting character, but one simply overshadowed by all the other good characters in this story. Iris Marle was a character I also loved. I always remembered her as being kind of flat and falling short of her potential, but on this reread, I realized that wasn't the case, and she was by far more dynamic than I had recalled. Her semi-coldness towards Rosemary felt very real. Iris being, the younger sister who didn't inherit the money from her quote-unquote uncle like Rosemary did, and it felt very slighted by that. It caused Iris to be resentful of her sister, and it caused a distance between them. And there's a little bit, of the damsel in distress going on here with Iris, but she's also like shrewdly cautious. Like she doesn't run off with Anthony, and she doesn't like agree to marry him until she's sure he's safe. But, she was a very strong character. I do tend to tire of these characters in Iris's archetype who just, tend to be, mooning about and are, over dramatic in a romantic, cheesy sort of way. But with Iris, that wasn't really the case. She was much better than what I had remembered. And her name, of course, Iris, refers back to the Poirot short story, The Yellow Iris, which Christie expanded into Sparkling Cyanide. And it's probably a short story I should have given a little more attention in this video, but, I didn't. And we have Anthony Brown, who was another very good character. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot here. Our resident roguish sort of man who Christie does so well. I was glad that Christie resisted the temptation here to add more thrillery elements his way, because he is a spy. It's all just sort of background info for Anthony. I liked how he was in prison and you think he's a criminal, and it turned out he was just undercover for a little bit. It's a pretty good red herring, and quite frankly, it made me enjoy Anthony's character more. He felt so alive. I kind of wish maybe he really was a petty criminal. That was a little more interesting, honestly. But a nice change from these typical upper class, or I guess middle class is the British term here. These men we see so often as suitors. And I would argue Anthony is our true hero of the novel, and we probably spend less time with him, and the story is told less from his point of view than many of the other characters. But Anthony is the one who solves the crime. He's the one who comes back and saves the day. He figures out the glasses weren't correct. correct, and he's the one who saves Iris and initially believes it's Ruth. He's in position where he's both sleuth and suspect, which is interesting. And while this isn't unique to Christie, I can't really think of another character who is both firmly in both positions equally credibly. Usually it's more one than the other, but that's not really the case here with Anthony Brown. And then we have Stephen Faraday, who did make my top one time Christie characters who weren't murderers or victims list alongside his wife Sandra. I did combine them for that video since we're told they work as one unit, but I separated them here. And I've always found it hilarious Rosemary calls him Leopard because he's so unlike a leopard. He's the least leopard like character in this novel. He's so passionless. It's just so hard to believe he's this like ravishing lover, but Christie don't convinces you of that. It's not a stretch to believe it when Christie does it. And the Farradays are amongst my favorite Christie couples. I love their relationship. The coupling born out of political need and ambition transforms into an actual loving marriage. And I think Stephen is such a fascinating character on his own right. His political opportunist who will join whatever party he needs to win, demonstrating a lack of principles, but also a lack of courage. I mentioned this before, but I do like following politics, especially elections. The way candidates maneuver strategically through a campaign and then later their political body, as an actual elected official, is not unlike a murder mystery. I mean, there's no murder usually, but just the way a murderer moves throughout a novel is very similar to how a politician moves throughout their career. And I think what we're supposed to glean from Faraday's political wishy-washiness is that he couldn't have murdered Rosemary because his indecisive nature and because he lacks the courage to do so. Like, he couldn't even break up with her, like, never mind murder her. He wouldn't have the guts. Who does have the guts is his wife, Lady Alexandra, although she didn't do it. And she's just another just outrageously fantastic character. She's an all-time great for me. I have this cool-minded wife of the cheating husband who still loves him, and he loves her. I always get a kick out of her mother thinking Sandra was definitely the killer for, like, really no reason. Like, there's no doubt in her mind. And Sandra's story here is that everyone underestimates her. Her husband thinks she's ignorant of his affair. Her parents think she's a killer. She's more or less the prime suspect for most of the other dinner party guests, but she's innocent, and they underestimate her thinking ability. Her parents called her the awkward daughter no one would want to marry, but in reality, she's the smoothest of the daughters and probably the most, quote unquote, useful of their daughters. And she's the one who can maneuver about all these different situations and control things with the invisible hand. The Kidderminsters view their daughter's worth in their beauty, which is connected to their worth as a wife, but they never consider Sandra's savviness and intelligence as being useful as a wife. And Stephen, who does recognize those qualities, still thinks he can pull a fast one on her, but as we see, Sandra gets the better of everyone. I easily believe Sandra could have murdered Rosemary if she needed to, but she didn't need to because Sandra can maneuver the situation in her favor. She does not have to resort to murder.
And the final character to talk about here is Lucilla Drake, Aunt Lucia. Pure comic relief she was, and she just rambles on, including at one point where she stops Colonel Race and Anthony Brown from rescuing Iris because she just has to be talking. And I loved her as this like older widow who is completely taken in by her son and his repeated claims he's going to commit suicide if she didn't give him the money, and she's totally under the belief that Victor is such an angel and nothing is his fault and people take advantage of his good nature. I mean, really to a delusional degree. I mean, Christie uses her expertly. She's not in every scene, and she doesn't, attend the dinners, but, Christie knows when to use her as comic relief. It's very light, but it makes a big impact. And, of course, she's also, the older, poor relation that no one... It's not fair to say no one likes her, but no one listens to her either. I mean, she keeps trying to get Iris away from Anthony Brown. That fails, but, we see her type of character a lot, but I thought Lucilla Drake is one of the best versions of these characters. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Sparkling Cyanide and what you think about my thoughts on Sparkling Cyanide. And yes, I really did attend a dinner party with a large round table. No, I didn't actually experiment to see if Sparkling Cyanide's murder plot could work. I did contemplate it, but I didn't do it. And just, as a little aside here, my dad received a gift box in the mail the other day, and he didn't know who it was from. And it was very tempting to eat from it. And it reminded me a lot of like the poison chocolates case and these other murder mysteries. I always ask like, who would just eat a random thing they got from the mail from someone they didn't know? And you know what? Apparently, surprisingly, happens a lot. It was very tempting to eat from this gift box, but we didn't because we didn't know who it was from. We did eventually find out who it was from, so it was safe, but it wasn't poisoned. But anyway, I just thought I would throw that out there, as I often wonder who would do something like that. Turns out probably more common than I would have thought. But anyway, next week I am returning to the deep dives into mystery subgenres with the surprisingly short history of the historical murder mystery. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files,